Hey y'all, Nesso here. Today I'll be talking about our newly primed frame, Saryn. Saryn is a condition-based Warframe that was recently reworked in update 17.10. This rework was met with both praise and disdain. Personally, I love the rework. Granted, I did not play her much before the rework because she was simply a press 4 to win frame. I did hold back from playing her after the rework as well because it was mentioned Saryn would be the next prime. Now that her prime version is out, I've played enough of her to fully understand the changes and synergies that accompanied the rework. The fact that her abilities work hand in hand to augment each other has easily placed her on my list of favorite Warframes. Anyway, regular Saryn's parts are located from Kel'Thuzim, the boss on the mid-tiered planet of Sedna. Saryn is a tankier frame compared to other female frames, having a base armor of 175, and her prime version having a base armor of 225. This makes her the third tankiest female Warframe, beaten only by Valkyr and Chroma. And while I say that she does have higher armor compared to other female Warframes, this is only average for most male frames. Think of Excalibur for how tanky she can be. With an average health pool of 375, and an average amount of shields at 300 at rank 30, this gives her a decent survivability, but with her medium tiered armor, she still can be killed easily if eaten bullets to the face. Saryn also comes with a base sprint speed of 0.95, making her the slowest female Warframe. While her prime counterpart does have a boost to speed, placing her in the average pool of 1.0 sprint speed, she does make up for having a slower speed than most frames by having an above average energy pool of 225, and her prime version is tied with Volt Prime for the highest energy pool at 300 at max rank. Being a condition-based frame, Saryn does have a passive, increasing the duration of status effects by an additional 25%. Now on to her abilities. As mentioned before, Saryn's rework did greatly increase the synergy of all her abilities, as well as their complexity. As such, I'd like to point out that I make videos to express my opinions on things about the game, but most importantly, I make them so people will understand how things work. Saryn is hands down the most complex frame in the game, and there are many ways to build her and optimize her abilities, so keep an open mind with her abilities and I will do my best to explain them. Starting off with her first ability, Spores. At max rank, this ability inflicts an enemy with 3 spores, each spore dealing viral damage per second for 12 seconds. These spores can be bursted by hitting them, causing viral damage with a 100% status chance, reducing enemy health by 50%. When a spore bursts, it spreads 3 additional spores to each target within its base spread range of 16 meters. It is possible to keep viral up 100% of the time by spreading the spores back and forth between the enemies. While viral only lasts 6 seconds, with Saryn's passive, this is increased to 7.5 seconds. Popping the spores also refreshes the duration of the status effect, making it a very powerful ability. With its guaranteed viral proc and the rate at which it can be spread, Spores is already a very powerful ability. But as mentioned before, DE has added a bit more complexity to Saryn's abilities. For Spores, it has a hidden feature when the spores are bursted on an enemy affected by toxin. The toxin damage increases the damage dealt when the spores burst by half of the damage ticks of the toxin. If multiple toxin procs are on the target, the damage is combined to the spore's burst, increasing the damage it deals. In addition to this, when the spores spread the viral status effect, it also spreads the toxin status. This toxin proc deals 50% of the burst damage 11 times in 10 seconds. To add even more complexity, the toxin proc spread by spores can only be spread to a new enemy once. The only way to refresh or increase the damage of the toxin caused by a spore is to apply another toxin proc from another source, then spread them again with another spore burst. This gives spores great synergy with weapons that deal guaranteed toxin procs such as the Acrid and the Torrid. Power Strength increases all forms of damage that Spore deals, from its Toxin Dot to its Spore Burst and the Toxin Spread. Power Range increases the range in which the spores can spread, and Duration increases the duration of the spores. Spores does also have an augment called Venom Dose. This allows spores to be casted on allies, granting them additional toxin damage to all their attack. At max rank, this increases it by 100%. This damage dealt is similar to an elemental mod, increasing the damage based on the weapon stats. This toxin damage also increases the damage of Warframe abilities, and this augment allows Saryn to take on the support role, increasing the damage of her allies, be it to help you level weapons or to augment the shield polarize to improve its destruction. This augment is often underestimated, but is a very powerful mod in a squad setup. For Saryn's second ability, she has Molt. She sheds her skin, removing any status effects affecting her, and spawns a decoy at her cast location to distract the enemies. This decoy has its own health pool and shields, and when killed, explodes, dealing a decent amount of toxin damage with a guaranteed status chance within its base range at 10 meters at max rank. The decoy can also explode from its duration running out, or if you recast Molt, due to Saryn being restricted to only having one decoy out at a time. Molt can be a good reactive ability as it has no cast time or animation. This can also be done in the air, and the only time I think you can't cast Molt is when you get knocked down or if you happen to be rolling. With Saryn's rework, Molt was given synergy with her first ability. When casting Spores on her decoy, the energy cost of Spores is reduced by 50%. The decoy also has an additional effect to cause all spores on it to simultaneously burst when the decoy explodes. This allows Saryn to set up ahead of time and detonate her decoy when the enemies are in range. Apply Intoxin to enemies within decoy's explosion range and Viral to any enemies within the Spores range. Saryn has access to the regenerative Molt augment. This augment causes Saryn to regenerate 50 health every second for 10 seconds when casting Molt. While 50 health doesn't sound like much, it does greatly add to her survivability, and Molt is often your best form of protection against higher leveled enemies. You will often find yourself casting Molt to distract them, and regenerative Molt regen can easily be maintained. Now for Saryn's third ability, Toxic Lash. This ability imbues Saryn's melee weapon with additional toxin damage and a guaranteed proc. It also improves her damage reduction when parrying while active. The Toxin proc deals half of the bonus toxin damage every second for 10 seconds. It is also worth noting that the additional toxin damage does not combine with any primary element on your weapon. It is its own separate instance of damage. As mentioned, Toxic Lash does grant damage mitigation, which can be very useful but is more beneficial to certain types of weapons than others. The maximum damage reduction parrying can do for your Warframe is capped at 90%. Melee weapons themselves have a base damage reduction when parrying. Claws, daggers, dual daggers, sparring weapons, glaives, nunchakus, tonfas, and whips have a base damage reduction of 35%. Blade and whip weapons such as the Mayos, dual swords, fist weapons, gunblades, swords, and staves have a base damage reduction of 60%, and weapons such as the hammers, heavy blades, machetes, nikanas, pole arms, scythes, and finally swords and shields have a damage reduction of 85%. So while Toxic Lash only adds a maximum of 5% more reduction to weapons like the Nikana, the ability can add a ton more to the weapons such as the Fangs. Back to Toxic Lash's offensive capabilities, granting a 100% status chance to melee naturally has great synergy with Saryn's Spores. But some features that Toxic Lash has is that when it is active, at least one spore is guaranteed to burst per melee attack when attacking a target with spores on it. In addition to this, popping a spore with Toxic Lash active also restores 2 energy to Saryn. While 2 energy doesn't sound like much, each time you cast spores you spawn 3 spores, meaning 6 energy. Spreading these spores spawns 3 more on each enemy, which means 6 more energy per enemy. The energy you gain back adds up quick, and in the end restores a lot of energy back to Saryn. Being the energy intensive frame that she is, this is a great feature to her kit. Power Strength increases the damage increase and damage reduction of Toxic Lash. Power Duration affects its duration. Toxic Lash does come with its own augment, Toxic Cloud. This causes melee kills while Toxic Lash is active to spawn a 2-meter gas cloud that deals 150 toxic damage at max rank. Augments have not been reworked following Saryn's rework, and I find this augment to be the weakest out of the 3 available to her. The base range of 2 meters is affected by range, but having such a small base range makes the increase with power range barely improve it. It also only deals toxin damage, not status, so it has no synergy with her spores. If you're doing a infested defense mission, there may be use for this augment, but I don't think it is worth it. Now for Saryn's ultimate, Miasma. This ability deals a decent amount of corrosive damage every second for its base 3-second duration to every enemy within its base 15-meter range. pretty straightforward, but there are a few things Saryn can do to increase the damage of Miasma. When an enemy is affected by toxin or viral, the damage dealt by Miasma is increased by 100%. If both affect a target, then the ability deals 200% more damage. These status effects need to be on the enemy before casting Miasma to take full effect. Another feature of Miasma is that if you have a decoy from Molt out, it will explode before Miasma's first tick of damage. The damage of Miasma also increases based on the power strength affecting Molt and the amount of HP lost on the decoy. It is worth noting that if you have enough power duration that increases the length of Miasma unequal to a second, for example 3.4 seconds, Miasma will tick for a reduced amount of damage to make up for it. While Miasma does have a bit of complexity to its math, I find that in most cases you will end up using Spores as your main source of damage. Miasma does help melt things, but does require a bit of time to set up. But the most useful thing Miasma provides is a small amount of crowd control. This is Saryn's only form of CC, and when you get to the stage where your Molt instantly dies, Miasma is the only ability that can help keep Saryn alive. Power duration affects the duration of the CC and the duration of the dot. Power range increases the effective radius, and power strength increases the damage dealt by this ability. Now on to how I mod Saryn. For my first build, I run a high power range build. This allows me to keep my spores going all over the place. It has decent duration, and I use regenerative Molt to help my survivability. My second build is a more balanced build, focusing on more duration and power strength for Toxic Lash. Again, I use regenerative Molt to add to her survivability. My third build is a support build focusing on more duration and power strength for her Venom Dose augment. As always, these builds are how I play, mod to your liking. So, is Saryn worth it? While I personally enjoy Saryn and how her abilities work together, for a newer player, I would have to say no. While some people say frames such as Loki and Ivara can be complex frames, in all honesty, the only thing that makes them complex is the mods required for them. Once you acquire those mods, they are simple frames to play. Saryn is one of the very few frames that truly is complex and difficult to play in a higher tiered mission. She is a frame with 3 damage abilities and 1 ability to improve her survivability, but not by much. In the current state of Warframe, a frame that is built around doing damage does fall off a lot quicker than a Warframe that is able to augment their weapon's damage. And while she is capable of dealing damage in a large range and able to slowly melt her enemies, in the time it takes for a Saryn to set up her abilities, a frame with a weapon setup, such as a Zephyr Tonker combination, can just easily swoop in and destroy whatever she was setting up against. In addition to this, Saryn herself is a very squishy frame in long missions. Despite having a higher armor pool than most female frames, when your T4 survival run reaches around the 30-minute mark, she can easily be one-shotted. Her main form of defense in most cases would be Molt, and parrying with melee. And while Molt does do well at distracting enemies, it can instantly die and enemies may simply just ignore it, leaving Saryn vulnerable. When it comes to parrying, if an enemy shoots you from behind or your sides, the damage mitigation just doesn't happen. In really intense situations, Miasma is another form of defense with its short crowd control. Being an ultimate ability though, the energy cost is quite high and thus has issues at being a reliable source of crowd control. While Saryn is also able to keep her energy pool going with Toxic Lash and Spores restoring energy, in most cases, enemies die too quickly for it to be properly used against lower leveled enemies, and at higher levels, Saryn herself has to risk a lot going into melee range to be able to pop those spores with melee. While I did mention a lot of negatives about Saryn, she is still a very good frame. When it comes to support, her Venom Dose augment is probably her most powerful ability. With my configuration C build, build, Venom Dose gives you 205% more damage as Toxin for 101 seconds. This is a big boost considering it works with abilities, and for weapons, it is a bigger boost to damage than a Serration does for your weapon. She's also arguably better than frames such as Nyx and Ember, who only have crowd control at their arsenal, but are simply outclassed by frames such as Loki, Nova, and Frost. And then, of course, she's better than a frame like Oberon, who's a jack of all trades, excelling at nothing. Granted, Saryn is a damage frame and a different type of Warframe to the ones I just mentioned. Her abilities do well until hitting higher armored enemies, but if you run with a squad that runs corrosive projection, her abilities are viable even in endless missions. The only frames that use damaging abilities that can come close or beat Saryn is Mag and Equinox, but Mag is restricted against highly shielded enemies, and Equinox requires trading with another Equinox. For veterans, I'd like to start off saying that Saryn rework is here, and while people don't approve of the changes, they are here to stay. The new Saryn, despite protest of older Saryn players, is no doubt better after her rework. Before her changes, she was simply a press forward to win frame with a build of negative duration. This old setup was only viable against medium-tiered enemies, and while it could be effective at what it did, and if it was paired with an EV Trin with a squad with corrosive projection, it perhaps was viable against endless missions, the new Saryn is much more flexible with builds, and while her new setup is not instant damage, the damage is still there. Without finding new ways to build or change our setups, Warframe would be a very boring game, so I doubt the old Saryn will ever return. Now that I got that out of the way, I have to say, yes, Saryn is worth it for veterans. Personally, playing Saryn has been the most fun I've had playing Warframe for a very long time. Her fragility required me to constantly pay attention, or I could simply end up dead to one shotgunner walking into the room. I always had to be ready to cast Molt just in case something dangerous was around to shoot me, and managing energy was also pretty fun with taking a risk of going in and popping Spores. Being a Trinity main, I'm used to being tanky if I ever decided to go melee. And Saryn's kit does push her towards being a more close quarter kind of fighter, and while damage honestly was never an issue, survivability was always a challenge when meleeing with Saryn. With melee parry being her main source of damage reduction, whenever I got shot in the back or side, I'd lose chunks of my health, assuming I even survive. The rush of charging into a big crowd, not knowing if I'd make it out alive, was great, and I can see myself playing Saryn very often. If Warframe is getting a bit stale, I highly recommend trying her out as a melee frame. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good one.
Meow.